Hi, this is Bob Wells here, and welcome to Undercurrent Stories. This is the show where we hear about people's interests and uncover some fascinating stories at the same time. I hope you enjoy today's show. In today's show, we're going to talk about logical fallacies, and I'm delighted to be joined by two of the world's leading experts on this subject. Jim Cliff and Mark Levermore host a very popular podcast, Fallacious Trump. Each episode focuses on a single logical fallacy, and using examples from the former President Donald Trump, UK politics and pop culture, the show explores how and why it fools people, how to avoid committing it yourself, and how to counter it in an argument. As a listener of the podcast myself, I would thoroughly recommend checking it out, as it's not only educational, but the two hosts bring the whole subject of logical fallacies alive with a fantastic sense of humour. Hello and welcome to the Undercurrent Stories, Jim and Mark.
Thank you very much. That's
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, very kind. I think possibly excessively kind.
Well, I thought I'd start off on a good note. Keep you guys happy.
Hyperbole, if nothing else. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Good.
Well, maybe we are. Who knows?
Well, yeah, absolutely.
How do you measure these things?
Well,
why not use a hyperbole?
I mean, what I would say, actually, given that we've been going for 5 years, I think we probably are the longest running podcast about logical fallacies.
Oh, well, there you go.
Exists. So
in a probably
you
the
can
best
make that
lager in
argument
the world kind of way.
Yeah. Well, I haven't really found too many others. I've had lots of serious ones or episodes of, but are there any other podcasts that are totally on logical fallacies?
To that?
There's been a few that have kind of gone through a number of fallacies and explain what they are. And there's other shows like Stuff You Should Know, I think, that did a series on logical fallacies for a few months and stuff like that. But I mean, there's certainly none that have been going as long as we have all kind of focused on it as intensely as we have.
And I think our kind of focal point that's been the thing, the logical fallacies, obviously, but the fact that it's Trump derived is the bit that's got to run through it for the longest. That's given us, that's our hook.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about the show in a bit more detail later on, please. But in the meantime, before we talk about logical fallacies, can you each of you just tell us a bit about yourselves and, what your life's journey was like and how you became involved in the show?
Wow.
Who's going to go first?
I'll go first if you like. Well, Jim and I met when we used to work at, can we mention Channel 5?
I think we can,
in Covent Garden.
Other TV channels are available.
Other terrestrial TV channels are available. Is it still terrestrial? No, not solely. We met there and did plays. Jim directed a play that I was in, and then we made a film together. And because I'd kind of done sort of acting and filmmaking and all that kind of stuff, as well as philosophy at college, I made films at college. And then we just sort of did that, and then went off and did separate things like, having a family.
As you do.
Yes, you do. And then came around, and then I got a phone call from Jim, who had said, I've written this book. Do you fancy doing a podcast about it? And I went, yeah, all right. Not having spoken to him for years, but I went, yeah, that sounds good. And it's the best fun you can have in your own living room.
Yeah. It certainly sounds like you guys have fun when you do it. Yeah. And that's how you got into it.
Yeah. So it kind of, so doing the podcast thing, it's just another branch of performing, because I also play in the band. So the music in our podcast is provided by The Outbursts, which is the band that I'm the drummer for. Oh, right. Yeah. Which is just another excuse for dressing up and showing off, really. And this is kind of the podcast, I guess, is a slightly more intellectually based strand of doing that. Yeah, so I mean, up and showing off.
So the band and the podcast is all about an outlet of your creativity, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
That's
great. That and because my day job is to make films. I make films for international charities about work that they're doing to transform lives around the world. So I a filmmaker, so a shooter, an editor, a producer, all of that kind of stuff. So so that's a kind of creative thing, isn't it? What they say, if you love your job, you'll never work a day in your life. Well, that's not true.
Most days. Hard work,
yeah, it's bloody hard work. And often we work days and nights on end, and actually, Jim does the same. Is that not true?
Yeah, I mean, I do. Well, I've worked in corporate film for years. Now I mostly do editing, and yeah, I mean, it's a creative outlet because I have been making films for years and doing. I write as well, and I don't do any music stuff like Mark does. But yeah, this is just kind of another outlet, another way of telling stories. Really, that's what it's all about.
Yes,
yeah, and poking fun and letting out your frustrations with current British politics.
Yes,
or
yes.
current political issues of the day. Yeah. So it's also, actually, I was talking about that to somebody who was saying, "Oh yeah, I really like your show. How do you manage to deal with British politics? I find I'm shouting at the radio about the things that you're saying." And radio?
Showing your age, Mark.
They listen on gramophones.
On the wireless.
Yeah, the wireless.
On the wireless. Yeah, the Bakelite wireless.
That big piece of furniture in the corner. And they were saying, how does it not drive you mad? And I think actually the way that the podcast is set up, it's a lens through which you can comedically peruse the week's events in politics without going quite mad. You just get a little bit mad. Yeah.
I've always been interested in film and TV. Always kind of wanted to work in that area. As Mark said, we met at Channel 5, and after that I worked for the British Board of Film Classification as an examiner, classifying films for 8 years, I think.
Right.
And since then have been making videos essentially for companies, events, all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. Working as a video producer, and I'm now in kind of editing for TV. So it's all that same kind of throughput, and that's part of why we became friends. God, 20 plus years ago. And have remained friends.
Yeah. That is weird, because when we made a film together called Nothing to Declare, which is available online, is it?
Probably still, I don't know.
We made a film because we had done a play that Jim was directing when we were at Channel 5, and we just went on, did a play, acted in. So I have acted in the West End.
Oh, right.
Technically, since it's in Soho, yeah.
It's like two doors down from Channel 5. Yeah. And then after that, we were talking to somebody about what's next. So we were going, probably a feature film. And he said, yeah, anyone could do a feature film. What you need to do is to try and distill it down to 10 minutes. So that was the challenge. So that's when we set about making Nothing to Declare, which ended up being 10 minutes long. And at that time, one of my kids came with me, and he's like 4, I think. Yeah. And actually his voice right at the end of the credit sequence goes, "Can we go home now, please?" And now he's 30. So that's how long.
That's a few years ago.
Yeah.
Most listeners will have heard of a logical fallacy. But can you just summarize it and what it actually is, please?
Well, in the introduction to the show, I'm the one that says a logical fallacy is an error in reasoning that leads to bad or invalid arguments. Yeah. So it's either a deliberate act on the part of the arguer, or it's we've always had those heated arguments where you just reach for, but what about you? Kind of thing. And
it can be a way where you're just trying to come up with a way to back up something you've said or a claim that you've made, and it's not based on good logic, or you're not backing it up in a way that is actually a really a reliable way of deciding whether that is true or not. And as Mark said, it can be deliberate, can be something that people kind of do to try and convince people when really they might know that their argument isn't very strong. But often it can be something that, we all do it essentially, where it's just part of something that is our cognitive makeup. We have biases that are really hard to overcome, even when you know about them, that you, for example, think that, certain things are more likely to happen if you roll a dice and you get several ones in a row, you think, well, the next one can't be a 1. Because that's happened multiple times, but actually
the next one must be a 1.
Yeah, either way.
But
whereas it's completely random. And those modes of thinking, those kind of heuristics that we just snap into as a quick way of understanding the world, lead us down bad reasoning paths, essentially.
Yeah. So there's assumptions involved as well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what about the history? When did we first become aware of logical fallacies as a sort of society?
About 2,300-ish years ago, Aristotle wrote a piece called Sophistical Refutations, where he kind of, for the first time, named a set of logical fallacies. Yeah. There's about 12 or 13, depending on which version you look at. But those were the first ones that were kind of codified. And ever since then, really, students of logic and thinking have been looking at ways that people tend to phrase arguments and ways that people back up their claims, and naming common types which end up leading to bad reasoning and bad arguments. And I mean, it's even now we identify them from time to time. We have a kind of every 11 episodes we do a thing where we identify a new one, essentially give it a name and say, look, here's a thing. We don't think it's in any of the lists that you'll tend to find online of fallacies, but it is a common mistake that people make. And this is some examples of it.
That's interesting, actually, because you've got, was it 130 episodes, 150 episodes?
120. We just did 125.
Okay, 125 episodes, and obviously the sort of the classics would say there was 12 or 13 of them, and now it's got to that, and you're still finding them. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So,
I think I identified a new one just the other day, which I'm excited to do in a few episodes' time.
Yeah. Yeah, for some reason we ended up with this tradition that every 11th episode, Jim identifies a new one. So it's quite a good discipline. I have no idea why that tradition's in, because we didn't do it for the 11th, did we?
No, it was just it happened that I started kind of identifying new ones and thought, let's do that one here, and then it just
cognitive
like we'd done a few.
What they are.
We'd done a few, and they just happened to kind of fall on the 11, the multiples of 11, and I thought, well, let's keep doing that, I guess.
Yeah.
Why not?
And what makes you guys so interested in them?
Hard to say, really. I think Mark did philosophy at uni. I did psychology. And it's kind of both ways of thinking about thinking, essentially. Yes. And it's just something I've always found fascinating, how people fool themselves and why they believe certain things, and how they're fooled by other people and kind of deliberately or by accident. And so it's something that I took an interest in and thought it would be an interesting thing to write about. But I looked around and saw that actually there was a few books that detailed a lot of logical fallacy and probably did it a lot better than I could, and in a more cohesive way. And then so I kind of gave up the idea of actually writing something about it. But then Trump came along, and I thought, this is quite interesting as an angle, because it's a new way of looking.
Did you spot him doing them, committing the fallacies or utilising
very
the
much so. Yeah,
right.
There were several things he said was like, well, that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't lead to the conclusion that you've come to at all on that. And so, it seemed like a topical and interesting way to write about them.
Yeah. And I know we've probably already answered this. I was going to ask how many logical fallacies are there, but you're finding them all the time. So I suppose it's going to depend how long your program goes on for.
It could be. Yeah. I mean, there was the difficult thing in figuring out how many there are is that there's quite a lot of overlap. Some logical fallacies are actually really groups of fallacies, and it's a way of describing a particular phraseology or way of thinking. Yeah. And within that group, there might be kind of 9 or 10 different ones.
Yes.
And there's also overlap where a particular argument, you could make a case that it is one logical fallacy or an example of a completely different one.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of an example of just different mistakes that people make. And so we do discuss that in the show, and like there'll be ones that come up where we're kind of saying, okay, this is a kind of a subset of this previous one that we talked about, but it's different. Here's why it's different, and why you might classify these examples as this one. And But yeah, that means it's more of a spectrum in some ways than it is really kind of distinct fallacies necessarily. They're just kind of given names to make it easier to talk about them, really.
Yeah. Well, I guess actually it comes because they belong to where do they derive from? Well, you talked about cognitive biases, and I guess they derive from those kind of things. We align ourselves with these particular thought patterns. So there's a whole group of, under that subset of bias alignment, there's a whole group of behaviors and one of the ways that they get expressed is through the use of logical fallacies in arguments, so that whilst they all belong to a certain area, it's quite fun teasing out the individual examples. So we did last time, we did the just because fallacy, and this time we almost did a because I said so fallacy, and they're kind of similar, and so that's quite nice to identify that and talk about the overlaps, but yet find distinct examples. Equally, it's quite fun to suddenly realise, Michael Gove saying that is an example of three fallacies,
right,
which will turn up every now and then. So Jim will say, next time, let's have a look at this one.
We have used the same clip for a few different ones for Michael Gove,
Just on that subject, and we're obviously talking subjectively about logical fallacies. We haven't really sort of got into detail of them. I'm going to go into the detail a bit later on, but just so we keep listeners interested, can we just mention that one, just because? So we're going to let us, just tell us a bit about just because that's a great example of a logical fallacy, I think. And then we'll go into a bit more subjective stuff, and then we'll talk about some of these fallacies in detail, if that's okay.
Yeah. So just because is really where people are unwilling to give a reason for their argument or evidence for their claim.
Yeah.
And there's multiple reasons that might be. It might be that it's just a kind of a thing that they're not comfortable talking about, or it might be something that they don't actually really have a reason. And so if they say, well, it's just because it's kind of the thing that harried parents tend to resort to when their kids are constantly asking why or asking, what the reason is that they have to actually do a thing, or they've been told to do something. It's like, just because I said so, and because
I said so.
Yeah. And it's also in that way, it's a thought terminating cliche as well, isn't it?
Yeah,
because it shuts down the argument, because you're indicating that you're not prepared to provide any more justification for the position that you're holding in the argument, and you just say, well, it's just because. So I'm going to brook no more questions. You're just going to have to do it.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
And there's also, as we were talking about kind of overlaps, there's a bit of an argument to authority there, because you are expecting the person to accept your argument based on usually who you are, because it's a person who is in some authority, whether it's a parent or just an older figure or someone like the president, for example, who gets to say
both of those things.
Who gets to say, just, you accept what I'm saying because, just because. And what they're really saying is because I have authority over you and I expect you to do what I say.
And of course my go-to straw man, no, he just looks like one. Boris Johnson does a similar thing. He gets even more frustrated about that position than Trump does, I think, because his entire life he thinks he's got the moral high ground, or the by God and my right. He just ought to be listened to, and so gets really angry, which is a delight to watch, when people ask him questions beyond, and he will try and shut it down almost with a just because. He implies it's because I was Prime Minister, I was educated at Eton, I'm 10 times smarter than you are, I just pretend that, but he isn't. So, and he will pretend to be calm about that, but he gets really very angry and he wants to shout, just because I said so.
And I've noticed and he also sort of says, as most of the British people would agree, that type of thing.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's also a kind of appeal to the to the pop.
It's another one. Yeah,
argumentative popular. Which is an appeal to the people. So yes, he. Yes, well, as we talk about our latest episode, they are. All the people in the Tory party are very in the arguments about the Partygate scandal. The whole thing is that they hold themselves to different standards because they are privileged people. That's fundamentally what they believe, I think. Boris certainly. And yet they won't say it. Because if they said that would let the cat out the bag.
Yes.
So what they do is divert that with the British people.
Yeah.
And of course that in itself is a flawed argument because which bit of the British people are you talking about? The Eton educated, privately funded, so those people, or there aren't many of those. Trouble is they're all in power. So there are illogical statements that they all make, and we point them out, and that's where the meat of the show comes from.
Yeah, and I think the humour brings it alive, and I think it, certainly from my point of view, it makes it a lot easier to understand. But on a serious note, why do you think we should be aware of logical fallacies?
I think it's very easy to be taken in by bad arguments and convinced of things, which can lead to, for example, Brexit.
Yeah,
stuff like that.
Yeah, January the 6th.
But bad things can happen because people are convinced by nefarious actors of things that aren't true, and it's easier to convince people of things that aren't true if you do understand this kind of thinking, and are prepared to employ those methods, and hopefully by being a bit more educated about those ways of thinking and spotting that kind of argument when it comes along, it insulates you a bit and makes you slightly less likely to be influenced by that kind of thinking.
And also hopefully slows down the untruth, because there's that phrase that the lie is halfway around the world before the truth got his trousers on. So it's that if you can spot the logical fallacies being used, then the lie can't get past you. So it doesn't perpetuate and proliferate.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you sort of you point a thing out there. It's quite important. We do get to understand when somebody's coming at you with a logical fallacy, and it sort of brings to my mind education. Mm-hmm. I mean, they did have in the past the trivium education method, didn't they? Where it was sort of logical reasoning and rhetoric. And I guess at that time, the ancient Greeks had that type of education.
Yeah.
I guess if you do that, you're actually trained from a young age to be able to see any errors of reasoning. What would you say about that?
I think it's a fantastic thing, and in fact, I don't know how widespread it is, but certainly my kids have done critical thinking lessons at school, at secondary school.
That's really good.
And I mean, we never did anything like that. I thought that would have been brilliant. I would have loved that.
Yes.
But yeah, the fact that they can kind of come home and say, "Oh yeah, we learned about this today," and like it's just ways of things like looking at newspaper articles and considering the source, considering whether the evidence that is presented in the article actually leads to the conclusion that the article might make, or looking at what the motivations might be of the people who are making the claims, that kind of thing. And it really, really useful stuff to be more media literate and to try and avoid being led down the wrong path by things you might read.
That's amazing, because I did edit a film together, which was a bid for a fund in the US to fund education, to fund lessons in education establishments in the wake of the fake news proliferation. So to do exactly that, to teach people critical thinking, to teach people to not see things on face value. And I also was involved with doing some kind of social media comedy shorts in Sierra Leone for the elections there, to stop people just mashing the share button because they've been stirred up by, the red mist has descended by somebody sending unsubstantiated stuff around, because they know that it will raise the hackles of those people that receive it, and then they will mash the share button and send it on, and consequently not vote for the person that in effect it's libel, isn't it? The libel is being said about, because you're so angry about it that it appeals to those base emotions rather than logic. We all laugh in the face of Mr. Spock and how he can't actually get the gang and all that kind of stuff. No, I knew you couldn't say that. Yeah, but they do that. That's at the end of the show, the original series. There's the laugh on the bridge.
Yeah. He's the butt of many jokes. Unfortunately,
because
I always felt very victimized by that.
Yeah, but that's because you've got pointy ears as well. It's nothing to do with the logic bit. But that he was able to detach himself from emotion. Until he wasn't, which is useful for Jeopardy reasons. He was able to see the logic that was going on or being mangled in the process and point that out, and to have that stuff, certainly in Sierra Leone, out on social media, competing with the emotion-raising stuff was quite effective. I mean, whilst they don't claim to have solved the problem, it was that particular election was one of the most peaceful they'd had in Sierra Leone. Fewer people died that time round. So
it's a good metric.
Yeah, exactly.
And you contributed to that.
Yes, I worked with the social media content producers, kind of mentoring them on how to actually, really, in a way, it was kind of how to inject comedy in, because if people are laughing rather than being angry, they will also, you can employ.
It's another emotion that makes people share.
Yes, you're employing a cognitive bias. So if people are laughing at the jokes that you're sharing with them, then the message sneaks in underneath. And we've been doing that for
that's what we've been doing.
I finally worked it out the other day. Yes, that's what we've been doing. Yeah.
So, I mean, you mentioned there about social media. I mean, my thoughts would be that probably Twitter is one of the worst. Well, let's put it another way. Now is a time in our sort of history where logical fallacies can thrive, I would suggest, with social media. What would you say to that?
I think it's, as I say, emotion is what makes people share. It's not really factual content generally that people share stories of on Facebook or Twitter or things like that. Right. It's when a story makes you feel sad or happy or angry or whatever. And angry seems to be the easiest thing to make people in various ways. Certainly that seems to be the tactic that some on the right have chosen, is make people angry, and then you'll get likes, you'll get views, people will share your stuff. And I think it is a bad thing for that, but there's also lots of benefits to social media in terms of connecting communities that have historically been very isolated, and individuals who might be in areas where they aren't actually able to express themselves truly and be who they are because of the environment they live in, whether the local laws or just the kind of the people that live near them, that kind of thing, can find that community online, which is incredibly valuable.
Yeah. And do you think we all use logical fallacy to some degree, either knowingly or unknowingly?
Definitely. I will be absolute about that. Well, we do it, definitely. I notice it because I'm tuned to it, but I sometimes will say something and I'm like, okay, that's actually not a good argument, or I haven't made that convincingly.
And with the knowledge that you guys have accumulated, do you ever think to yourselves, actually, this is a good time for me to use one for my own benefit or whatever? Do you ever...
I haven't done that yet.
I haven't done that. No. That's a thought. Yeah, but I have. Well, in a way, I've noticed that if I'm having an argument, which one does without being able to put too fine a point on it. I find that part of it's terrible, really. Part of the set of tools in the arsenal of arguing is not only to deploy probably logical fallacies without thinking about them, but also to spot them being used by the other arguer and to call them out.
Oh, you actually call them? You name the fallacy.
Then it becomes, which is
people don't like that.
It's terrible.
No, it's not a great way if you do educate yourself about fallacies. It's not a great way to be where
to use
someone
it as an aggressive thing. Yes.
If you just go, you've just used a straw man. It's better to kind of help that person to understand why the argument they made isn't convincing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And say, look, kind of if we looked at it this way and gave another example of that kind of way of thinking, say, look, this wouldn't convince you, so that's kind of similar to what you were doing.
Yeah.
But it's really obviously, there are times when that is hard because you're emotionally involved in it.
Yes, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you're caught up in the emotion, and that's the thing. It's a very that's why it's quite an appealing thing, and a very it feels a kind of an intelligent thing to do, rather than just to rely on your brute strength or your shouty voice or your red face to actually participate in an intellectual process and talk about what's going on in the argument rather than have the argument. And in that way, it does seem to disperse it. In doing this podcast, we've been exposed to and become part of, I guess, the critical thinking community. And last year we went to their kind of annual conference, the QED conference, and it's full of people who do lots of podcasts, or they are interested in these kind of basically critical thinking. So
science, skepticism, atheism, all kinds of critical thinking and ways of trying to be better at working things out logically and that kind of stuff.
Yes. And they are the calmest, most approachable and friendly people. And I think as a result of using critical thinking, the discipline of it does allow you to detach yourself from just falling for being angry and retweeting something.
Yes.
Or, it's
I would say one of the go on.
No, I was going to say they must be the most considered bunch of people.
It's interesting. It's hard to kind of get something past them. Obviously, I mean, not that we particularly tried, but there was a couple of years ago we went to one, and there was a magician there, and for a magician, that's a really hard room because everyone is thinking, "Oh, how's he doing?"
How's he doing
looking at
It's hard.
Everybody's skeptical.
Yeah.
So for listeners who they've heard of logical fallacies and etc. As I say, in a minute we'll get into them. But how easy is it to spot a logical fallacy? Do you get a bit of a gut? Should people get a bit of a gut feeling, do you think? If somebody's coming at them with an argument, they think, hang on a minute, there's something wrong there.
One thing I would say is I think it's probably easier when you're listening to an argument you already disagree with. Because that's one of our cognitive biases is you tend to be more critical of arguments that you already think are wrong. And you will be more careful to look at, well, why? This is already wrong. Why is it wrong? Whereas actually it's really important as a good critical thinker to evaluate arguments that you already agree with in the same kind of way and actually think, well, am I relying on this being true because I want to believe it or because I already think it's probably true? Or is this actually a good argument that is convincing?
Yes.
And that's true in evaluating your own arguments as well. If you are making a claim, providing evidence for that claim, looking at that evidence and thinking, well, is that convincing evidence? Does it follow directly from the premises to the conclusion? And would it convince anyone? Or is it just that I think it makes sense? Feels right to me.
Yeah, feels right. I agree the hell out of it.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So in answer to your question, how easy is it? It's quite difficult to spot it in your own arguments, I think, unless you know you're deliberately doing it because you work for a public relations firm for a political party. Then you're fully aware that this is going to make people angry, so we'll just do that. Yeah. And if you do that and you're on the left wing of British politics, people complain and say, "Oh, you're just doing what the right does," without complaining when the right does it. But that's neither here nor there. Yeah. But so it is really quite difficult. I think as Jim says, it's dead easy to spot it in the opponent or the person taking up the opposite position to you in an argument. It's dead easy to spot it because you're determined to find fault, as it were. And of course, if you can spot a logical inconsistency, then that doesn't make it the person's fault. It just the difficult thing then is to talk to them in such a way as they would understand that what they've done is an illogical step, because in the heat of an argument, nobody wants to hear that kind of stuff.
No.
So,
and you alluded to that earlier when you sort of said, "Oh, that's a straw man." You wouldn't necessarily come at them. You would do what you just said.
That would be a bad way to do it. Yeah, I think the one thing is educating yourself about them. Or, the more you learn about them, the more you are likely to spot them in arguments. Mm-hmm. One thing I find, there's a psychological phenomenon called the Baader-Meinhof effect, which is that when you
Baader-Meinhof, the terrorist.
It's named after them. And when you hear a new phrase or something, you suddenly start hearing that phrase all over the place and think, "Well, I've never heard of that before." And it's weird. It's like for the next few days, it's just everywhere suddenly, and that's just something that our brains become attuned to, something that we found interesting or that we feel like we've just learned, and then you suddenly start spotting it. When you get a new red car, suddenly everyone's got red cars. It's like, So
I think Kate Bush did a song about that.
What I find is when we do an episode about a specific fallacy, I'll then start seeing examples of that fallacy after the next couple of weeks. I'm like, there it is again. Yeah. It's everywhere.
Yeah. So I wonder whether that's that strange phenomena, to quote her song title, that there was an argument in the woosphere that the day after the answers are published to the previous day's Sudoku or whatever the thing is on the thing that used to be like the mastermind game, but you do it with words online. That thing,
Wordle.
There you go. Yeah. So when the answer's published, suddenly it's easier, even if you haven't tackled it yet.
Yes.
The answer's out there. So perhaps actually what we're doing in the to kind of steal what the woo argument. In fact, if what we're doing is adding to some knowledge of the world, then possibly that's why we're finding them. They're just out there, but they've just been revealed because we're, as you say, the world's leading experts.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Obviously, we haven't got time to go into every logical fallacy, but can you just please elaborate on and give some examples of them in use?
So one example is anecdotal evidence. People often use anecdotal evidence to bolster the claims that they make because it feels like really strong evidence, because it's something that's happened to you or something that's happened to someone you know. And so it's more convincing than data that you might read. And there's a kind of trope that the plural of anecdote is not data, but it really depends how big that plural is. If there's lots and lots of anecdotes in a carefully controlled, randomly controlled blinded trial, that's data. They're all just individual cases, but each one of those people is likely to feel that their individual experience gives more weight to anything they might tell people about what they've been through. So I've got an example from Trump, and this is when he was talking about hydroxychloroquine and its use for COVID.
Yeah.
Many people are using it all over the country, and just recently, a friend of mine told me he got better because of the use of that drug. So who knows?
So
Yeah. Yeah.
The thing is that COVID is something that, while it can be really bad for some people, many people just get over it. And it just, might take a week, might take a little longer. It's very, very variable. So any individual person taking anything that might help it and then getting better might feel to them like that thing helped. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it helped. And when they've done trials on hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin and various other things that people claimed might help, they found actually they didn't really do anything. And in some cases, they actually made it worse. So
like bleach.
Yeah, that kind of thing. So Trump arguing that, a friend of his took it and got better is not a great thing for the president to be saying, because a lot of people listen to what he says.
Yeah. So not only might it not be true that the taking of the hydroxychloroquine caused your getting better, it's probably not true that a friend of his told him that.
Well, no, that's probably not true. No, it's a thing we have to talk about very frequently. Is a thing we'll say is, even if this was true, it's bad reasoning, but it's almost certainly not true, because he says so many things that are verifiably false. But often we'll kind of, for the sake of the argument, we'll assume that it was true for a moment and then explain why the reasoning is bad.
The other butt of our jokes is often, well, I guess it's because the whole premise of the thing was set up because Trump was coming up with the use of these logical fallacies. So where better to go than Trump Light, which at the time was Boris Johnson. And and there's a clip here where we talked about the straw. I think it was episode 2, the straw man fallacy, which is, if somebody makes a strong case against you, then you can simply pretend that they made a different argument. You make a straw man out of their argument. You pretend that they have said that, and then you can smash the straw man down without any problem because he's made of straw. There are versions called Steel Man and Steel Bot and all that, which are all sort of based on this idea. And so basically you can massively oversimplify what they said. So
you make up an argument they said. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, you make up what they said. The
idea basically is to make an argument that sounds kind of quite like what they said.
Yes,
it's
that could be said in a way that is able to be down by you more easily. So the example we had, so this is pre-Brexit. So I think this is definitely. So this is like 5 Tory leaders ago. So this is Boris when he's on. This is also several Good Morning Britain presenters ago. So this is on Good Morning Britain, and he's talking to Holly Willoughby about the reason we should go out of the EU is because there's all these rules about bananas.
How many directives do you think there are from the European Union on bananas? There are 4. Do we need them? Do we need to be told that you cannot have, abnormal curvature of your bananas?
So because the thing is that isn't the argument. And Holly Willoughby, that well-known intellectual and logician, actually points out that so Boris is, as well as this and Kippers, he would be going around. It's always about the fish. He would go around typifying the EU's stance on things in ways that he wanted them to be, and fundamentally make people angry about it. And I think the underlying purpose of the entirety of the Brexit campaign was to pretend that the EU had taken something away from you, and that these people, Boris, would get that back. So we would take back control. We would take back our borders. We would take back our sovereignty.
Our abnormally curved bananas.
We would take back.
And that's the thing. The bananas, yes, the EU has rules about curvature of bananas, but not rules that say you can't have them, bananas, but rules that say that if they're the kind of bananas that you wouldn't want to buy in a shop, like humans wouldn't look at and think, oh yeah, that looks lovely, then those are classed in a different way, and they're usually then because of that class, sold for different purposes, like animal feed and things like that.
Yeah.
So it's just about how they're priced and how they're classed, not about whether you're actually allowed to have them or how curvy your bananas are allowed to be.
Yeah.
But that makes it sound like the EU are being too draconian and giving us rules we don't want.
Out of the EU in order to be able to eat bent bananas.
Yeah.
That's kind of, that's
so,
not one of the messages I recall people saying we want to eat bent bananas.
So the straw man in that particular example is where he's making them look so stupid that anybody sees it like that, think, oh yeah, it's stupid. We might as well vote out.
We should definitely vote against that. Yeah, we should definitely like that. Yeah, and it's not true. There are 4 directives in the EU, but they are not prohibiting you from selling bent bananas. They're just saying if you can't sell them, then you could do this with them. There are instructions for suppliers as to where to.
Yeah, essentially it helps supermarkets to know that they're getting a particular quality of food if they're buying a specific class of produce. Essentially,
they're not going to get small bent green ones if they're buying Class A bananas.
But if you misrepresent it as a kind of as this draconian rule, then it's an easier thing to use in evidence that your argument to leave the EU is a good one.
Whereas
and the hilarious thing is when we talked earlier about how do you counter these things. So Holly Willoughby, of all people, just says, but it doesn't say that in them anywhere. And Boris says, oh, yes, it does. She said, no, it doesn't. And then just reads them out. I said, one's about this, one's about that, the other one's about that. None of them do that, do they? And Boris, right at the end of the interview, says, no.
Really?
So that's it. That's the way you counter it. You
have in advance the specific knowledge.
Exactly. You just present the actual truth. In a way that hopefully can't be disagreed with.
Yeah. So what's next?
Well, final example is one called the slippery slope, which is quite a common one. It's one that is used often when laws are being made or like to make things that some parts of society think are bad more available, and they'll go, oh well, if this happens then the more bad things will happen inevitably, and the suggestion is that those, this is just the beginning of a slope, and once we start our way down there'll be no stopping it. And
as well as using political examples, so as well as using Trump and British politics, we also look at things that happen. We call them fallacies in the wild. There are things that happen in the worlds of entertainment and literature and wherever, popular culture, that aren't necessarily politics. So we find examples of which there are very, very many. So sometimes they're used for comedic value, as is in the case of this one.
When you have cable and can't find something good to watch, you get depressed. When you get depressed, you attend seminars. When you attend seminars, you feel like a winner. When you feel like a winner, you go to Vegas. When you go to Vegas, you lose everything. And when you lose everything, you sell your hair to a wig shop. Don't sell your hair to a wig shop. Get rid of cable and upgrade to DirecTV. Call 1-800-DirecTV.
So that's a kind of extreme example, obviously played for comedy. But yeah, people make these kinds of arguments when people suggest taking down statues of people who are, with hindsight, seen to be not great people. The argument from the people who want to preserve that history and don't mind that they might have owned slaves or done whatever they did, is often, well, if you're taking down this statue, what's to stop taking down statues of Churchill and they continue down that slope of people until they get to someone that no one really would have any problem with at all. Yeah. And suggest
Paddington Bear.
And suggest that they're, that's the inevitable end point of going down this road. So if you don't want to get there, we shouldn't do this thing that everyone's suggesting we do at the moment. And it's been used against things like gay marriage and stuff like that. People are saying, if you allow gay marriage, what's to stop people marrying children or animals and that kind of stuff? And what's to stop them is that no one is asking for that stuff.
They're just asking for this one step. Not all the others, yeah.
That's quite a popular one, that. You hear that all the time, I think.
Yeah. Well, and the Manic Street Preachers did it with...
Yeah, Your Children Will Be Next.
Your Children Will Be Next.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Right. So where can people find out more about your podcast?
The best place is on our website at fallaciousstrump.com. And that's got all our kind of socials and links to the episodes.
Yeah, so we're on Facebook and Twitter, and are we on Instagram? We're on YouTube?
Not unless you've started one and not told me.
I may have. No, I haven't. No. So we're all over the socials, but yes. So if you just search Fallacious Trump,
we'll be there.
Put it out in the search engine, it will pop up because our podcast is proliferated across many platforms.
Have you ever thought about turning this into a TV show?
I mean, if the offer came, I wouldn't say no, but it's not.
No, I just because of you could almost have guests on, and they would sort of they'd have to spot them, in other words,
It's an interesting thought. Yeah.
So is anybody listening out there who's in the okay?
Yeah. That feels like hard work.
Well, Jim and Mark, this has been a really interesting, enjoyable conversation. I think that the way you use humour to dissect logical fallacies and have some fun is a great way to remember them. I've learned a lot. My guests today have been Jim Cliff and Mark Levermore. Jim and Mark are co-hosts of the show Fallacious Trump, a link of which can be found on the show notes. Thank you for coming on the show, Jim and Mark.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Bob. Thank you very much. It's been very enjoyable.
You have been listening to Undercurrent Stories. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to share the show link to your friends and family, and if you have 60 seconds, I will be most grateful if you would please rate and review. To hear more episodes, please subscribe to the show and visit undercurrentstories.com. If you leave your email in the link, we will notify you as soon as new episodes are released. Also, check out our social media links, details of which can be found on the show notes. Until next time, this is Bob Wells wishing you all the very best.